Well, aloha. Feels like it's been a while. Although when I look back across the records, last time I spoke here was 2 months ago. But I have been busy since then. Oh, there we go. I suddenly forgot where my book was. Now I remember. It's so great to be back together here. To see all of you. And this is a great month to be in. We're entering the month of Thanksgiving. We have so much to be thankful for. So much we are blessed to have. And I want you to think back to those verses that I had Pastor Tony read, because certainly those are some dark times when you look at those. But also, times of great opportunity. And I want you to be thinking about that for a moment. Because when you read what's going on in social media, and everyone has so many questions, assumptions, what lies ahead? And asking, where do we go from here? But we have a book. We have the Word of God that tells us what is going to happen. And we read in those verses in Matthew of supposedly dark times ahead. But I want you to realize that if we are the generation that those events describe, then we should be rejoicing because His kingdom is coming soon. And we also have an opportunity because now more than ever, people are asking, they want answers to life's hard questions. And unlike everyone else, we actually have the book that tells them the answers. We have such an opportunity waiting for us if we are that generation. Now, I don't know for sure if we are, but I'd be glad to be proven wrong either way. Because as Paul said in Philippians, to live is Christ, to die is gain. Either way, we are extremely blessed. But those passages in Matthew referred to dark times, but also ones of great potential. And today we're also going to be looking at a passage that depicts some dark times, but also times of great potential ahead. And today we're going to be looking at the book of Nehemiah, chapter 4, verses 13 through 23. And just some background about this passage before we really start diving into it. In here we see Nehemiah is going about the work of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. They had been let home after 70 years of exile. And everyone who went back home was so excited because now they get to worship God in their homeland, and hopefully better than the ways that their fathers did, who had led to the destruction of God's holy city. And they set forth on the task under Nehemiah's direction for first rebuilding the wall and eventually God's temple. But what initial enthusiasm that they had for the project starts to fizzle out. They realize the immense work ahead. And they're starting to get discouraged even before the rubble that was left over from when the city was destroyed is even cleared. Their neighbors all around them, they know are plotting violence against them. They as much as said so. They're warning them, letting them know, this work that you're going to doing, it won't last. We are going to destroy you, as the Babylonians once did. And then, even more discouraging, their fellow countrymen, sowing discontent, telling one another, we will never succeed, we will be destroyed, God has abandoned us. And Nehemiah addresses this situation. And we're going to start off in verse 13. Therefore, I positioned men behind the lower parts of the wall, at the opening. I set the people according to their families, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. I looked and arose and said to the nobles, and to the leaders, and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. And it happened, when our enemies heard that it was known to us that God brought their plot to nothing, that all of us returned to the wall, to everyone to his work. So it was from that time on that half my servants worked at construction, while the other half held spears and shields and bows and wore armor. And the leaders were all behind the house of Judah, those who built on the wall and those who carried burdens, loaded themselves so that in one hand they worked at construction, and with the other they held a weapon. Every one of the builders had his sword girded at his side as he built, and the one who sounded the trumpet was beside me. Then I said to the nobles, the rulers, and the rest of the people, the work is great and extensive, and we are separated from one another along the wall. Whenever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. So we labored at the work. Half the men held their spears from daybreak until the stars appeared. At the same time I said to the people, let each man and his servant stay at night in Jerusalem, so they may be our guard by night and a working party by day. So neither I, my brethren, my servants, nor the men of guard who followed me took off our clothes, except everyone took them off for washing. May the Lord add his blessing to the reading of his holy word. Now this passage, the sermon that we're going through, I titled it, A Battle on Two Fronts. And Nehemiah is an astute commander, administrator for this task that God set before him. And he's well qualified for it. If we were to go back to chapter 1 in Nehemiah, we would see that when he's introduced to us, he is a cupbearer in the service of the king of Persia. And we think of this at one time as merely this person who samples all the king's food. But in reality, he is the king's closest confidant, the one who hears a secret, his private thoughts. Because he's always there with the king, ready to sample his food. And at times he may be the only one with the king, the one who can probably be most candid with him because of the relationship. Nehemiah has seen the inner workings of the greatest empire of his day and age. He was uniquely qualified for this, and we can certainly learn from his example of how he approached this situation. Nehemiah, when this task came about, when discouragement started to arise among the people of Israel, he was observant to the conditions. And we can see this being played out through this passage. The first thing Nehemiah did when he was confronted with such an immense task, the enthusiasm drying out, the threats to his people, even the discontent of his fellow countrymen, he first prays, then sets forth a watch in response. And this comes to us from Nehemiah 4, verse 9. Nevertheless, we made our prayers to our God, and because of them, we set a watch against them, day and night. May we have such an approach when problems arise. I know I often forget that when I'm frustrated with the situation, what's the first thing I should do? Turn to God in prayer. And if I'm certainly struggling with it, I'm sure that there are many others. But Nehemiah, when confronted with such a daunting task, he prayed. And in response to his prayer, he knew he needed more information. He set forth people to observe, to watch, to see what was going on. And then once he had the information, we know that once the enemy started issuing open threats, started to threaten his workers, Nehemiah responded. He didn't simply stand by and wait and hope something else would take care of them. No, he knew this was a battle on two fronts, both spiritual and physical. So he started arming the people. And if we go back then and look at verses 13 and 14, we can see as much. Therefore, I positioned men on the lower part of the wall, at the openings. I set the people according to their families, with their swords, their spears, and their bows, and looked and arose and said to the people, the nobles and the leaders and the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, will fight for you and your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. He prayed. He responded. But then we see another reason why he is such a good administrator, and God had placed him in such a role. We see then in verses 14 through 18, that when the enemy backed off, when they saw that Israel was strong, did Nehemiah draw down his guard, relax his ways? No, he upped his game. He reinforced his position. He wanted no means by which the enemy would think that they are a weak people, that they would not be ready. In verses 15 through 18, we can see how they not only responded, they carried shields. Half of them were divided up into one group or another of working or guarding. Not only that, those that worked were armed, ready to respond. They knew what to do when the sound of the trumpet was blown, that they were to rally to wherever it was, and knew that God would fight for them there. Nehemiah also remained vigilant. In verses 21 through 23, we can see that Nehemiah, even after the threat looked gone, continued to post a guard. That when was their most vulnerable time? At night when they slept. He had a guard posted there. They were sacrificing their own hygiene, it looks like, except they washed their clothes on occasion at the end of 23 tells us. But the comforts of life, they put aside. They remained vigilant to the threat. Nehemiah was observant of the conditions around him. The next important thing that Nehemiah realized in all of this was it was a battle waged on two fronts. And oftentimes, we don't get to see both sides of the battle play out. We can assume one side or the other. Scripture often tells us of one or the other. There is a passage, though, that we are going to look at briefly that tells us that there is a spiritual battle being waged in addition to the physical. In the book of 2 Kings, chapter 6, verses 14 through 17, in that particular story, the army of Syria came to attack the northern kingdom of Israel. But they were constantly confounded. It was as if Israel knew exactly where the enemy army was going to appear. And in fact, they did. Because God, through the prophet Elisha, would tell the king of Israel, this is where their army is going to come after you. And they were never there. Eventually, the Syrian king became wise to the situation and realized someone's tipping us off and not of my court. And they realized it must be this prophet. So he sends forth his vast army to the city of Dothan where he was at to besiege it so that once this prophet's out of the way, then we can get to the army of Israel. And this is where we come in. Starting in verse 14. Therefore, he sent horses and chariots and a great army there, and they came by night and surrounded the city. And when the servant of the man of God, that man of God being Elisha, arose early and went out, there was an army surrounding the city with horses and with chariots. And his servant said to him, Alas, my master, what shall I do? What shall we do? He could only see that physical army before him. And in this day and age, the Syrian army was certainly one to be feared. But Elisha answers. In verse 16 he says, So he answered, Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. Then the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and beheld, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. The servant responded in a way that any of us. He saw the vast army of an impending horde that was probably the most feared of his day. It was a reasonable response, one that we should not fault the servant for. But Elisha prayed because he knew of a greater army that was revealed to him, that of God's army, that which even the most powerful army of his day could not stand against. And if we were to continue, we would see that God answered the prayer of Elisha and blinded them. And they were sent home along their way. Nehemiah, much like Elisha, knew about the spiritual battle being taken place. another person who knows of the spiritual battle is the prophet Daniel. And in Daniel 6, the story of Daniel in the lion's den, when he hears of an order given by the king, an order that the king was convinced to make, that for 30 days no one should worship any god or any man except for King Darius, king of the Persian Empire. Daniel hears this, and certainly it is going to be a battle, both physical and spiritual. But we're going to pick up with Daniel once he hears this in verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open towards Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since his early days. Daniel knew that it was not just the physical battle that was going to take place, the threat to his life, but this was an attack on his faith. And he prepared himself accordingly. He knew that he was going to face a physical trial ahead if he was going to stick to his spiritual guns, as it were. So what did he do? He prayed. He prepared himself for the battle ahead. Another example that we can see, someone who acknowledges the spiritual battle, but does not heed the warnings he hears from it, comes to us from the book of 1 Kings 22, verses 4 through 5. And that goes back prior to the story that we read in Elisha, where Elijah is still the prophet, but he does not take part in this particular tale. But the Syrian king, yet in an earlier time, decided to attack the nation of Israel. And the southern nation of Judah was also facing the same threat. Now, something to realize about the politics of their day and age was the northern kingdom of Israel is known for always having bad, evil kings. And Judah occasionally has a king who is not evil, when you look through the line of kings and who they are. At this particular point in history, though, the king who reigns in Judah is King Jehoshaphat, who is recorded among being one of the better kings, being a good king who follows in the way of his father David. And the king of Israel approaches now the king of Judah to try to turn back this particular threat. And we continue in this story at verse 4. So he said to Jehoshaphat, this being Ahab, the evil king of Israel, will you go fight with me at Ramoth Gilead? Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses. And also Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, please inquire for the word of the Lord today. Jehoshaphat knew that this was not just a physical battle, but one that they needed to consult God on. But if we were to continue on that story, you would see how eventually Jehoshaphat did find a prophet of the Lord and did reveal that this was a trap that God was setting forth to punish the northern kingdom. And Jehoshaphat should not participate in this particular battle. Jehoshaphat did not heed that warning and almost paid for it with his life. He did realize it was a spiritual battle, but when the warnings were clear that he should not take part, ignored God's advice, and he almost paid for it. When I was deployed in a combat zone, I oftentimes we carried our weapons everywhere. Not only our weapons, we had the ammunition for it. We became hyper aware of the situation unfolding around us. When you carried that, when you realized the danger that you could potentially be in at any moment, you were hyper aware of the situation around you. And coming back home, it took a while for me to realize that random piles of trash next to the road don't randomly explode for no reason. That's the reality that I had to get used to for a time. But when we don't realize that a spiritual battle is also taking place, we're not prepared for it. When we're not prepared for the dangers of the physical world, we're not aware when they take place. That is why we see the wisdom here that Nehemiah displayed, that most of these people displayed. Jehoshaphat chose to ignore it, but the wisdom they displayed by being prepared for both aspects that they knew were going to take place. And I just love this quote, actually kind of the legend behind this in particular. During World War II, on the attack of Pearl Harbor, there was someone who addressed both sides of this particular issue. That man being Hal M. Fordry, Lieutenant Junior Grade, U.S. Navy. And he denies that he particularly said this, although kind of only because he prefers that the legend remain associated to it. That amidst all the gunfire, and depending on which account you follow, he either was running forth between the Japanese bombers and fighter aircraft, doing strafing runs on the ships, praying with the men, or he was somewhere in the line, passing the ammo back and forth, or even manning the machine guns. But he uttered this particular phrase, which is immortalized in some songs, "Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition." It was not just one particular aspect to that conflict. There were two. The particulars of the physical battle they were fighting, but also the spiritual. And that many people attribute later that they don't know exactly which is true, but they do remember that particular chaplain saying something similar, and it inspired them to defend harder. Then when it comes to the particular aspects of the fight that Nehemiah engaged in, both fronts mattered in this particular conflict. I want us to contrast two particular verses. The first one comes to us from Nehemiah 4, verse 10. Then Judah said, "The strength of the laborers is failing, and there is so much rubbish that we will not be able to build the wall." And contrast that with verse 21. "So we labored in the work. Half the men held spears from daybreak until the stars appeared." At one point, the men were disheartened. They were ready to give up. But then they turned to the Lord. They asked for strength, asked for advice on what to do, and they responded in two different ways, both the spiritual and the physical. And that got them ready to face the day ahead. And after this, we can see how they rebuilt the wall. If we were to continue on in the book of Nehemiah, they rebuilt God's temple. They restored a way of worship that had not been seen since the days of Moses. Maybe the days of David or days of Josiah, but worship God in such a way that their fathers had not done. And another fine example of both these aspects and how they affected the outcome of a particular battle. I can think of almost no finer one that comes to us than the book of Exodus. In Exodus 17, verses 8 through 13. And in this particular account, the children of Israel are traveling through the wilderness. They're on their way to Mount Sinai, and they come under attack by the tribe of Amalek. And we continue on in verse 8. Now Amalek came forth and fought with Israel and Rephidim. And Moses said to Joshua, "Choose some men and go out and fight Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand." So Joshua did as Moses said to him and fought with Amalek. And Moses and Aaron and Hur went to the top of the hill. So it was that when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands became heavy. For many of you or some of you that have done physical training or maybe have served in the military, you may have had the punishment where you had to do squats against the wall while holding your arms out like this. Even without a burden, that gets very, very tiring in seconds. Try doing it with a rifle, it gets hard. So for those of you who have done this, you can imagine how tired it must have been for Moses at somewhere around 80 plus at his age at this time, standing like this, staff in one hand, for hours upon hours upon hours. It's understandable that his arms are starting to get heavy. So we continue on, but with his hands becoming heavy. So they put a stone under him, and he sat on it. And Moses and Hur supported his hands, one at one side and the other at the other side. And his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the sword. The battle that they fought had two aspects to it, two different fronts that they were engaged on. Joshua, as he was commanded by Moses and by God, was engaging in the physical side of the battle. Moses, Aaron, and Hur, as God commanded, were engaging in the spiritual side of the battle. Both were commanded by God, and both were important to the outcome. So this day, when we're looking at this particular passage, we can recognize, we can take examples, apply it to our life of what Nehemiah had done in engaging in a battle on two fronts. He was observant to the conditions. He realized it was a battle on two fronts. And when you neglect one or the other, it's very easy to come into tunnel vision in our life. Part of my training in the Marine Corps was not only my particular job, fixing computers, but also how to lead a squad of Marines and sometimes a platoon of Marines, how to set forth weapon emplacement, the machine gun nests, overlocking fields of fire. And it's when engaged, we knew that for the machine gunners at least, I draw them out a map. Your field of fire is from that tree there to that rock over there, no higher than this, no lower than this. And the men to your right and your left have overlocking fields of fire. But if they solely focused only on what I told them and ignored what was happening to their right, to their left, there's the chance that the enemy could attack from those other ways. If we don't realize that there are two aspects to the fight that we engage in today, even now, both the physical side and the spiritual side, we are certainly going to be caught off guard. And then both fronts of the war matter. So in this day and age, when I look on social media, one of my kind of favorite lessons from my grandmother during her last days, and I'm not sure how much of it she was aware, because you kind of lose some of your self-control in the last day. She would get mad at the TV every time an ad came on that said, "You deserve something." And would to often respond with, "You don't deserve anything. You get what you work for, or you're blessed with the things that you have." And so many people today focus on what I deserve. I should have this, I should have that, instead of what I am being blessed with. But this being the month of Thanksgiving, and when we had our prayer meeting this week, and by the way, just a plug for that. Every Tuesday night here from 6 for about an hour, we meet together for prayer. And any of you are welcome to come, and we'd be glad to have you there. And also, I believe there's another one that happens Wednesday nights in Colville as well. But I gave those there a challenge that this month, when we pray, when we ask God for requests to help us deal with life, we should also thank Him as well. And by the time you get to Thanksgiving, you'll realize how many things you were blessed, how many ways you have to be thankful for. And there's so many other holidays that coincide with this month too, that we can express our thanks for. This Tuesday for me, though, is the Marine Corps birthday, which I think is a very important one, but that's just me being a Marine. But also this Wednesday is Veterans Day. We're not the only country to recognize this holiday, but I think it is important that we remember those who served our country. And if you're wondering who is deserving of your honor, your respect, your love, I would certainly think that this group qualifies. And I am going to point out that veterans are not explicitly called out in Scripture, although neither are Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Americans. But we are told to respect authority. And there's a particular passage that I like for this, because in the book of Romans, chapter 13, Not only does it tell us to listen to authority, but it tells us why we should. And in verse 3 of Romans 13, it says, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of authority? Do what is good. You will have praise from the same, for he is God's minister for you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil." We should certainly be glad when the government authority placed over us does the job they're supposed to, does protect us from evil. We should certainly give thanks for those who do it. We remember here, I think we do a good job sometimes in our history classes of remembering the major conflicts from the Revolutionary War, Civil War, the World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, both times in Iraq and Afghanistan. We remember the major conflicts. But I found this statistic kind of interesting. It comes to us from Global Research Firm, that in their account, from the year 1776 until now, that of those 244 years of our existence, we have been involved in conflicts home and abroad, our military, for 233 of those years, or 91% of our total history. To put that into more perspective, it's easier to count the years of peace, 21, where we were not involved in a major conflict. The longest continuous stretch from 1935 to 1940. 5 years. For those like Nehemiah who stood on the wall, who guarded, who inspired, who protected those from the physical side of things so that they could engage in the spiritual. We think of the major conflicts. The reality is that we have had many people sacrifice so much so that we can be blessed the way we are. If we continue on in Romans 13, we see in verses 8 through 10, "Owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. If there is any other commandment, it is summed up in saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. Love does not harm a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law." Our command of who do we show love, honor, and respect to applies, we can see, to everyone that comes under our sphere of influence, those we know, even those we don't. And the amount that we're supposed to pay out, it just tells us to pay out love. So this week, this Thursday, I ask that you think of, not just because I'm a veteran, I ask that you think of a way how we can best honor them. I'm still learning that myself. We have certainly gotten better since the days of Vietnam. But something to consider, that every day, 22 veterans take their own life. The veterans have some of the highest divorce rates compared to their civilian counterparts. That their rate of graduating with a 4-year degree is often lower than their civilian counterparts. We are certainly getting better in that regard. But I think our goal should always be to do better. But now, let us take time to thank those who have done so much. I ask now, if anyone has served in the armed forces of the United States, please stand. Thank you so much for all the work, for the sacrifices you have made. and for your families, for the sacrifices that you have also made when they were away, and the ways that you have supported them since. These are the people like Nehemiah, like the guards who stood on the wall, who protected us in ways that we often don't see or understand. May we never forget the work that they have done and the example that we can live up to ahead. Well, I thank you today for letting me speak again. It's been a privilege as always.